May 15th, 2026. We are in the 5th year, day 81, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will look at attacks on refineries, which will be very, very interesting again. We'll also look at how territorial gains were made again, because today we can actually report another one. And what we will also take another look at are, of course, some very interesting drone strikes around Crimea. Let's get started. I would say, let's not waste any more time. Yesterday, we looked at one of the largest airstrikes on Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. Kyiv, in particular, was hit very hard, and among the victims were also a lot of civilians. As we will see later, Ukraine is very good at hitting Russian refineries and depots, but at the same time, it suffers from a lack of its own air defense capabilities. Patriot missiles in particular are extremely hard to obtain, as they are capable of intercepting larger ballistic missiles. The Russians proceeded, as they often have before, flooding the sky with many drones to overwhelm the air defenses, and then, after several hours of continuous attack, they launched several ballistic missiles and cruise missiles afterwards. The reason for this is, of course, that the Russians hope the Ukrainian air defenses will be overwhelmed by the drones by the time the ballistic missiles arrive. Whether it's a lot of drones in the sky, high ammunition consumption, or maybe some systems that become unusable due to wear and tear. They don't care what happens until the missiles arrive. The main thing is that fewer of them get intercepted. These missiles hit energy facilities, military targets, and especially many civilian sites like residential buildings. And to keep the air defense consistently stable, you need a good mix of air defense capabilities that can hit ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, but especially those that can shoot drones out of the sky, so that the air defense isn't constantly overloaded. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, which is a Ukrainian source, the Russians produce over 550 Geran-2 drones per day. That's basically the license-built version of the Shahed 136 from Iran. There are also other types of drones that pose a danger to civilians. You all know me well enough. I'm not a man who just sits around and watches. That's why I'm dedicating this to a new fundraising campaign, United 24. Together with other German YouTubers, we will support a campaign to protect Ukrainian airspace so that essential resources are available during such attacks and so that many civilians do not have to suffer from daily airstrikes again. For everyone who wants to support, there's a link at the very top of the video description, or alternatively, for my friends watching on TV, there's a QR code displayed here. Together, we will certainly reach the donation goal, just as we have been able to achieve everything possible so far. Thank you for your support, both in previous fundraising campaigns and in this one. After devastating attacks on the oil depots and refineries at Tuapse and Perm, which led to production outages and complete destruction, Ukrainian drone strikes have apparently also reached the largest oil refinery in Ryazan. With a processing capacity of around 17 million tons per year, the facility is one of the most important refinery sites in Russia. Among other things, gasoline, diesel, and kerosene, commonly referred to as jet fuel, are produced there. So these are the resources vital for the economy, economic research, and the military simultaneously. What I find most interesting is that this refinery was considered for a long time to be one of the sites best protected by air defense. Either it's useless against Ukrainian drones, or, what I suspect much more, is that because of the losses at the front and the exaggerated deployment on Red Square for the parade on the 9th, many systems were simply moved away from here in May and were then missing. We've discussed that several times. If the Russians want to better protect any location, they currently have to pull systems from other places, because the stockpile doesn't have much left to offer. What's also noticeable is the regularity of such attacks. Within just a few days, large refineries or energy facilities come under fire again and again. The last two were even declared total losses. Kerosene is especially relevant here. Russia is waging a war that heavily depends on its air force, glide bombs, and constant air operations. That's exactly why refineries are increasingly coming into focus. This is slowly becoming a structural problem for Moscow. Large refineries can't simply be moved or completely shielded. They are huge stationary targets with complex infrastructure. Even if only individual parts are damaged, production, storage, or distribution can be significantly affected. But by now, the Ukrainians are no longer just trying to damage the most important parts of the production chain, but to destroy entire refineries or depots. A residential building was also hit during the attack. It looks like the drone was either jammed by Russian electronic warfare on its way to the target, or it deviated from its course. The flight direction toward the refinery was correct, but there was still a building in the way. I don't think that was intentional. Because why would the Ukrainians attack a single residential building when there's a very valuable, high-value target right behind it? And if they wanted to take revenge for Russian attacks like the one on Kiev targeting civilians, of course, then theoretically they could do that much more easily along their own border region. So why let a drone fly such an extremely long distance? And above all, it would become a huge PR problem for the Ukrainians if they started shooting at civilians with drones or deliberately targeting civilians. In the Kostiantynivka area, there are increasing indications that the Russian Air Force is just now entering the most intense phase of attacks for the spring and summer offensive in the Donbass. The situation is becoming particularly critical in this area here, especially the red area. With the red area, we definitely need to take decisive action. This is not what was captured yesterday. No, what we see here is the summary of the gains made over the past 3 weeks. But a few days ago, the Ukrainian 24th Mechanized Brigade released footage that is said to show Russian assault groups inside the town of Molocharka. That's the place here at the blue pin. And that's quite relevant militarily because the town directly defends one of the last functioning supply routes for Ukrainian units south of Kostiantynivka. A large part of the supplies for Ukrainian forces, as well as for units that are still indirectly stabilizing the Chasiv Yar area, continues to run along the route towards Stinky, which is the village a bit further north from there. For months, it has also served important functions as a rear firing position for Ukrainian artillery. That's exactly why Russian presence there is so problematic. Even small Russian groups can be enough to restrict supply movements, displace artillery positions, or bring drone reconnaissance closer to the Ukrainian lines. At the same time, Hill 211 and the eastern part of Kostiantynivka remain under Ukrainian control. Of course, this means that the Russians, as you can see here, are staying in the yellow area and were not able to spread out. So the decisive question is less about whether Russia fully controls the area and more about whether they manage to establish a lasting operational presence there. Because so far it seems like they have only managed to get through here with a few soldiers without fully controlling the strip of land. And we are seeing this pattern more and more often. Russian units first infiltrate dacha areas, patches of forest, or outlying built-up areas, establish small bridgeheads and footholds there, and then gradually expand them under drone cover and constant fire support. Particularly interesting in this context is, of course, the activity of Ukrainian drone units from the 36th Marine Infantry Brigade, because they documented a significant shift of Russian infantry movements directly to the eastern buildings of Kostiantynivka. Previously, the fighting was more concentrated on the dacha areas of Chemek and Metallurg. These are basically the ones located in the dark red area. Since April, there have been more and more hits directly at the edge of the city itself, but without actually capturing anything inside the city. This suggests that Russia is probably already using the outer zones largely as a temporary area of operations. But what OSINT analysts like me and many others notice is that the Russian 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade is also back in the area. Because the unit was stationed in the Chansk area for a very long time and was then reorganized and replenished in the rear area after many months. The fact that it is now being deployed here at Kostiantynivka suggests that Moscow is increasingly treating this section of the front as a focal point. The operational goal is slowly becoming apparent. Russia apparently is no longer primarily attempting an immediate frontal assault on Kostiantynivka, but rather the gradual destabilization of Ukrainian logistics east of the city. If the yellow area comes under permanent Russian fire control, the supply situation for Russian units southeast of Kostiantynivka could change. it would worsen. That's exactly where the risk of these slow Russian advances lies. They often look quite unspectacular on maps. Small gray areas, individual infiltrations, a few soldiers taking a walk in the neighboring village, gaining a few hundred meters of ground which may have been fought over again right away. But operationally, and I say this very deliberately, they can also create the conditions to put entire defensive areas under pressure weeks later if the Ukrainians do not react in time. Just like back then with the so-called rabbit ears of Dobropilya. So many people talked about a Russian breakthrough there, but I showed them that it wasn't one. We're seeing the same thing here, just on a slightly larger scale. And even there, although it didn't have any impact on the front, I warned that if the Ukrainians didn't react quickly enough, the Russians could expand here. That's exactly what the Russians are trying again with this advance on the front. That means it now only depends on how quickly the Ukrainians can react to this danger. Because if the Russians get into the town and are able to fortify themselves, it's very hard to get them out. And I could almost patent that sentence. Yesterday, I reported that vehicles from a UN aid mission in Kherson were attacked with FPV drones. Zelensky had already explained that Russia must have known exactly which vehicle was supposed to be hit. That seemed politically quite sensitive at first, because international organizations often phrase such incidents extremely cautiously. But now new FPV footage of the attack has surfaced, published, who would have thought, by the Russians themselves, who, as I already said, uploaded footage of the attack without expecting any consequences. And that makes the situation much clearer. The video showed that the operator was directly tracking the vehicle in plain view, so it can no longer be called a mistake or unclear targeting, since it was clearly and prominently labeled. Just like in the recent attacks that hit UN vehicles in Kherson, this isn't the first incident. It's politically explosive, because the drones are controlled very precisely. The pilot constantly sees the vehicle, actively decides on the approach and the impact point, and also calculates the approach angle himself. This isn't AI or some program that handles reconnaissance and the decision for such an attack. That's exactly why this material changes the political dimension of the incident, but not in favor of Russia, who, as I said, uploaded it themselves. But for the people in Kherson, this is nothing new. Attacks like this on civilian vehicles, roads, or supply points have almost become part of everyday life there. The only difference this time is that once again an international UN convoy was affected, and that the attack was effectively documented by the attacker's own video footage. Experts believe that this could become particularly uncomfortable for Moscow on the international stage. However, I believe that it will hardly make a difference because, as I said, the last attacks were also attacks on UN vehicles, which more or less came to nothing. Russian soldiers already assume that they will win the war, especially drone pilots who are not directly involved in active combat at the front. And by that I mean man against man or man against drone. That's why they also assume that if they win, they won't be held accountable anyway. And on the Russian side, it doesn't matter whether they attack civilians or not. Russia won't hold its own soldiers accountable here, so as things stand now, we're almost powerless if everything stays the same. On the night of May 15th, Ukrainian drone units apparently carried out an unusually wide-ranging series of attacks against Russian military targets. According to reports, 55 strikes were carried out against 23 different targets in Crimea, Taganrog, and Yeysk. The targets hit included a BE-200 amphibious aircraft, a K-27 helicopter, several air defense systems, as well as ammunition freighters in the port of Berdyansk. What's interesting is the choice of targets. It was apparently not about individual symbolic explosions here, but about the capability that Russia needs for control and supply in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. The loss of a K-27 helicopter or a B-200 doesn't just affect any random equipment on the airfield. Such platforms handle reconnaissance, transport, sea rescue, and coastal operations, and are especially important for military movements along the occupied territories. However, the attack on the air defense systems like the Tor M2 or Panzer S1 could be even more significant, because this creates a double effect. First, protective zones are disabled, then adjacent areas automatically become more vulnerable to further attacks. This is exactly how temporary pressure is put on the entire defense zone. The attack on the ammunition ship in Berdyansk also fits this pattern. Russia relies on moving supplies flexibly along the southern coast, so each strike on maritime logistics makes things much harder. It's exactly this supply chain between Crimea, the Sea of Azov, and the front. What's also striking is the operational breadth of the attack. Crimea, Taganrog, and Berdyansk are not right next to each other. The attacks force Russia to monitor and secure several areas at once. And that again becomes a major strain on air defense, the Navy, and military logistics at the same time. Keep the donation drive in mind and help protect the airspace. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renicky Silla and Dietrich Ferdi Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, or comment, and see you in the next report.